All right, let's tackle a big question. One that's been the source of a whole lot of jokes and, let's be honest, a lot of private anxiety for basically forever. A really fascinating 2015 study helps us get to the long and short of it, and it reveals that when it comes to this issue, we might have been measuring the wrong thing entirely.
You know the one. It's the question that just seems to loom so large in our culture. We see it everywhere, right? But what does the science actually have to say about the anxiety that surrounds this very personal measurement? Because according to a group of researchers, the real issue might not be about inches at all. Their study suggests the problem isn't in the pants, it's in the psyche. The real story here is about perception, it's about anxiety, and it's about body image.
Okay, so let's get into the details of this study. Researchers brought in 90 men. Now, they weren't looking for guys with a medical condition or anything like that. No, they were specifically interested in men who were already worried or dissatisfied with their penis size, even if, medically speaking, it was totally normal. And this right here, this is probably the single most important piece of this whole puzzle. Every single man in the study, even the ones with the most severe anxiety about their size, was measured by a professional urologist and found to be completely in the normal range. So right from the get-go, this tells us the issue was never about a physical problem. It was always about what was going on in their heads.
So, the researchers did something really smart. They didn't just lump all this worry together. They knew that not all anxiety is created equal, so they separated the men into two very different groups based on their level of concern. This really helps us see the spectrum of the issue.
And here's how they broke it down. On one side, you have what they called small penis anxiety, or SPA. Think of this as excessive worry, but it doesn't quite cross the line into a full-blown psychiatric disorder. But on the other side, you have body dysmorphic disorder, BDD. And this is a whole different level. It's an obsessive preoccupation with a flaw that might be tiny or even non-existent to others. It involves compulsive stuff like constant checking or comparing, and it causes real distress that messes with your daily life.
And let's be absolutely clear about BDD. The study makes a point to say this is a serious, chronic psychiatric condition. It often starts when you're a teenager, and in some cases, it's linked with a high risk of suicidal thoughts. So this is not just about vanity. It's a really profound and painful mental health struggle.
So the big question is, how does all this mental turmoil actually show up in the bedroom? You know, does the anxiety in your head affect physical performance and pleasure? Well, the researchers measured exactly that.
And wow, the results are pretty stark. We're looking at erectile function scores here, and a lower number means more problems. So the control group, the guys with no size concerns, they scored over 24. But the group with BDD, they scored just 13.46. That is a massive difference, and it shows a really clear link between that psychological distress and actual physical function.
And it wasn't just about function, it was also about enjoyment. When they looked at intercourse satisfaction, the control group scored a 9.6. Makes sense. But the BDD group was way down at 3.8. And even the men with the less severe small penis anxiety were only at a 5.9. So you can see that both levels of anxiety were taking a major toll on how satisfying sex was. Okay, but here's where the data takes a really weird and fascinating turn. You'd think with all these issues with function and satisfaction, these guys would be having less sex, right? Well, nope. The study found no real difference in how often these men were having sex. All three groups were just as active, which, of course, leads you to ask, why?
The researchers were a little stumped by this too, but they had a few ideas. Maybe these sexual encounters were a way of seeking reassurance, trying to prove their own fears wrong. For some, it might have been a compulsive need to compare themselves to other people. Or, hey, maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe just the basic, primal sex drive was strong enough to push past all that psychological pain. So, when you're feeling this intensely anxious, what do? You start searching for a solution. And for a lot of these men, they went looking for a physical fix to what they saw as a very physical problem. The study actually documented the most common methods people were trying. Things like jelqing, which is a kind of stroking and stretching exercise, vacuum pumps, the kinds of things you might see in late-night ads, and all sorts of different stretching techniques, sometimes even using weights or extender devices. These were kind of the go-to at-home fixes. And who was trying these things? Well, that compulsion to fix the problem was really strong. More than 42% of the guys with BDD and over 32% of those with small penis anxiety had tried at least one of these methods. And now, for the single most telling number in this whole part of the study. 0. That's right, 0. That's how many men in the control group, the guys without any of these body image concerns, felt they needed to try and change themselves. It just proves that this behavior wasn't being driven by physical reality at all. It was driven entirely by that psychological distress. So after all that effort, all that anxiety, all that money and time spent, what was the result? Did any of it work? The study puts it pretty bluntly. Reported success rates of all procedures tried were low. So not only were these solutions unproven and risky, but according to the men themselves, they just didn't work. So, after looking at the psychology, the sex lives, and the failed fixes, what's the big takeaway here? What does all this data add up to? Well, the study comes to a really profound conclusion. It all comes down to shifting our focus. I mean, when you put all the pieces together, the picture is crystal clear. The anxiety exists in men with perfectly normal bodies. That anxiety has a real negative impact on their sex lives, and the physical solutions they're reaching for are a total dead end. The problem isn't about the measurement of the body, it's about the perception in the mind. And this leads us right to the study's single biggest recommendation for how to actually help people. They say, don't just focus on the sexual problems. The most important thing is to first validate the person's body image concerns, to actually listen and acknowledge their distress, and then develop a psychological intervention. The solution isn't a pump or an exercise. It's therapy, it's support, and it's finding a new way to think. Which really leaves us with a final thought, one that goes way beyond this one specific study. In a world that is constantly telling us to measure ourselves, to compare ourselves, to fix ourselves, this research really forces us to ask a much bigger question. When it comes to our bodies and our happiness with them, maybe the most important measurement has nothing to do with a ruler at all.